Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. Khalid Malik, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics TESOL. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities and in a postdoctoral study program. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966Pakistani or use the QR code to join our Facebook group at
BS English, Level, BS 8th Semester Course Code, ELL 408, Introduction to Translation Studies, the 31st of May 2023, Question 08, by Dr. Khalid Malik, PhD Applied Linguistics. Question number 9. Functional theories of translation. This theory says that the theory of translation as a transfer between cultures is integrated into the theory of action because texts are produced to serve a particular purpose and person. That means that they represent actions designed to interact and communicate with others. 1960s and 1970s, under the influence of structural translation theories in linguistics, German translation formed two schools, the Leipzig School, represented by A. Neubert, O. Cade, and the Saarbrücken School, represented by W. Wills. The former was based on the transformational generative grammar, which means to have strict distinction between constant cognitive factors and the variable pragmatic factors. Latter was a loyal follower of the doctrines of Nida, which advocated the establishment of translation science. At this point, functionalist translation theory emerged. It aimed at solve the weak links in translation language schools, which drew extensively from the ideas of communication theory, action theory, information theory, discourse linguistics, and aesthetics of reception, and made the study's attention shifted from the source language to the target language. Functional school is sometimes also referred to as teleological school since Scopo's theory had a far-reaching influence on it. Katharina Reiss. Her earliest work can be traced back to a book published in 1971, Möglichkeiten und Grenzen der Übersetzungskritik, Possibilities and Limitations of Translation Criticism. According to the classification of text types, Reiss introduces an audio media type to cover the rising of translation and separate this kind of translation besides sticking the conventional three based on Boole's functions of the linguistic sign. Furthermore, Reiss mentions three main functions of those different text types, which are informative, expressive and operative, and shows the connection between three text types and various text varieties in the form of diagram. Besides, she also asserts that those three primary functions of translated texts have clear influence on the performance of translator, which expressive texts should have our identification of translation method, and operative texts require an appropriate translation according to the way the intended audience are assumed to respond to the text, whereas informative texts need to be translated with necessary expansions and explanations. This is called integral communicative performance by her. Read also, Translation Industry in My Eye. Hands for me. He tries to bridge the fractured translation theory and practice, and proposes that Scopo's theory should free from the constraint of original text centricism. In his book, Grundlegung einer allgemeinen Translationstheorie, Foundations of General Translation Theory, with Katharina Reiss, 1984, he addresses the framework of the theory. Scopos comes from the Greek, means behavioral objectives. This theory explains that translation is a behavior with objectives and results and must be based on the original language, and done through consultation. There are a series of principles, but Scopo's rule comes first. In addition, the translation should also comply with the intratextual coherence rule and the intertextual coherence rule, also known as the fidelity rule. Christiane Nord. For the first time, she introduced the academic ideas of functional school comprehensively and systematically, and put forward her own views for the deficiencies. In Text Analysis in Translation, 1991, she describes the internal-external factors of text analysis in translation, as well as how to make translation strategies which are in line with the objectives of translation, and also she divides translation into instrumental translation and documentary translation. The former considers translation as an independent information delivery tool of the cultural communicative behavior of target language, while the later one considers translation as literature for original author and original recipient to use in cultural communication. The second half of the 20th century witnessed some paradigm shift in translation studies, especially with the publication in German of Katharina Reiss and Hans Vermeer's Foundation for a General Theory of Translation and Justa Holtzmantri's Translatorial Action, Theory and Method, both in 1984. These set the pace for what is later known as functionalist approaches to translation, approaches that see translation as a communicative action carried out by an expert in intercultural communication, the translator, playing the role of a text producer and aiming at some communicative purpose. Nord 2001, 151. Functionalist approaches generally believe that the function of a text in the target culture determines the method of translation. They are said to have developed in opposition to the equivalence paradigm of the linguistic-based approaches, which see the source text as what determines the nature of the target text. Using the communication scheme of source path goal, they accentuate the importance of the target text as the goal of the translational process. One of the major proponents, Vermeer, 1987, 29, declares that linguistics alone is not effective because translation itself is not merely nor primarily a linguistic process, and that linguistics has not yet formulated the right questions to tackle our problems, cited in Nord 1997, 10. Quite a good number of translation scholars subscribe to functionalism like Vermeer, 1978, 1989, 1996, Reiss and Vermeer 1984, 1991, Nord 1997, 2005, Holtzmantri 1984, 1993, Honig 1997, Honig and Kussmaul 1982, 1996, among many others. Following are some of the major strands of functionalism.
Scopus theory.
The most popular among the functionalist approaches, Scopus theory was developed in Germany by Hans Vermeer in 1978, in dissatisfaction with the linguistic-based approaches to translation. He sees translation as an action governed by a skopos from Greek meaning purpose or aim. This purpose now determines how the translation is done. Vermeer argues that the source text is produced for a situation in the source culture which may not be the same in the target culture. It then follows that the translation should be produced to suit the purpose for which it is needed in the target culture. The source text is oriented towards, and is in any case bound to, the source culture. The target text is oriented towards the target culture, and it is this which ultimately defines its adequacy. Vermeer 1989, 2004, 229. Reiss and Vermeer jointly published Translatorial Action, Theory and Method in 1984 to give what has been described as the general translation theory, sufficiently general, and sufficiently complex, to cover a multitude of individual cases. Schaeffner 1998, 236. They see a text as an offer of information and translation as an offer of information existing in a particular language, and culture to members of another culture in their language. They hold that the needs of the target text receivers determine the specification of the skopos, and the selection made from information offered in the source text. Schaeffner 1998, 236. Thus translation goes beyond linguistic considerations to also encompass cultural issues. The question then arises, who determines the skopos? According to Vermeer, 1989, 2004, 236, the skopos is defined by the Commission and if necessary adjusted by the translator. Nord, 1997:30, adds that the skopos is embedded in the translation brief, which means that the person initiating the translation invariably decides what the skopos is. She agrees with Vermeer that the skopos is often negotiated between the client and the translator. The skopos of a text in the source culture might be the same as the skopos of the translation in the target culture, but that is just one of the different purposes for which a text might be needed in a different culture, as the purpose in the target culture might be different. Reiss and Vermeer, 1984, call the situation where the source text function is the same as the target text function functional constancy, while for the other situation where both texts have different functions, they say the text has undergone a change of function.
They say the text has undergone a change of function. Vermeer also gives two further rules, coherence rule and fidelity rule. Coherence rule stipulates that the target text must be sufficiently coherent for the target audience to understand given their assumed background knowledge and situational circumstances, while the fidelity rule focuses on the intertextual relationship between the source text and the target text. Schiefner 1998, 236. The nature of this intertextual coherence between the source text and target is however determined by the scapos. The theory of translatorial action. This theory, proposed by Holzman-Turre, draws a lot from action theory and communication theory. An action is generally seen as doing something intentionally, and communication basically means transferring information from one entity to another. Holzman-Turre's theory then sees translation as transferring information embedded in one culture to receivers in another culture, and the translator is the expert saddled with the responsibility of this information transfer. Using concepts from communication theory, Holzman-Turre identifies the players in the translatorial process: the initiator, the person in need of the translation, the commissioner, the person that contacts the translator, the source text producer or author, the target text producer, the translator or translation agency, the target text user, teachers for example, and the target text recipient, for example students in a target user's class. She does a lot to emphasize the role played by these participants in the translational process. The need for a translation arises in situations where there is information in a particular culture that members of another culture do not have access to as a result of the cultural differences among the communities, or as Nord, 1997, 17, puts it. Situations where differences in verbal and nonverbal behavior, expectations, knowledge and perspectives are such that there is not enough common ground for the sender and receiver to communicate effectively by themselves. Translation then is a process of intercultural communication aimed at producing a text capable of functioning appropriately in specific situations and contexts of use. Schiefner 1998, 3. And since the focus is on producing functionally adequate texts, the target text should then conform to the genre conventions of the target culture. This makes the translator the expert in translatorial action, who determines what is suitable for the translatorial text operation and ensures the information is transmitted satisfactorily. One interesting aspect of this theory is the introduction of new terminologies into the literature. For example, instead of text, Holzman-Turre prefers Botschaftsstrager, message carrier, a concept that broadens the traditional concept of text to include nonverbal aspects of communication, thereby doing justice to the complexity of communicative processes. Martin de Leon 2008, 7. Other changes include Botschaftsstrager production for text production and translatoriskes handle for translate or translation. The principle of the necessary degree of precision. This principle was developed by Honig and Kussmaul to provide a more detailed account of translation-relevant decision-making processes as against the framework theory of translation. Honig 1997, 10. One of the outcomes of functionalist approaches is that the translator can give more information in the translation if the scapos requires that. An instance is making clear in a target text what is not so clear in the source text. However, it is not clear to what extent the translator can exercise this liberty. To this end, the principle stipulates that what is necessary depends on the function of the translation. Honig 1997, 10. Honig illustrates this in this rather long quote. The term public school implies such a large amount of culture-specific knowledge that it is impossible to render its meaning completely in a translation. Within a functionalist approach, however, the function of a word in its specific context determines to what degree the cultural meaning should be made explicit. In a sentence such as, my emphasis. 2 a.m. In Parliament he fought for equality, but he sent his son to Eton. The translation will have to be different from translating the identical term Eton in the sentence. 3 a.m. When his father died, his mother could not afford to send him to Eton anymore. The following translations would be sufficiently detailed. 2b. Im Parlament kämpfte für Chancenglichkeit, aber seinen eigenen Sons schickte auf ein der englischen Eliteschulen. One of the English elite schools. 3b. Als sein Vater starb, konnte sein Mutter es sich nicht mehr leisten, ein auf ein derten Privatschulen zu schicken, one of the expensive private schools. Of course, there is more factual knowledge implied in the terms Eton or public school than expressed in the translation, but the translation mentions everything that is important within the context of the sentence. In other words, the translation is semantically precise enough. 1997, 11. Here the translator does not aim at an exact or perfect target text, but a text that is sufficiently good enough for the situation. The translator provides as much, or less, information as the readers need as determined by the scapos. Christiane Nord. Christiane Nord is one of the major proponents of functionalism. She agrees with Vermeer that the situation under which a target text is produced is different from that of the source text in terms of time, place, except for simultaneous interpreting, and sometimes medium. Thus the meaning of a text is found beyond the linguistic code, in the extra-textual situation. In fact, she even stresses that meaning interpretation depends a lot on the personal experience of the text user. A text is made meaningful by its receiver for its receiver. Different receivers, or even the same receiver at different times, find different meanings in the same linguistic material offered by the text. We might even say that a text is as many texts as there are receivers of it. 2001, 152. Nord however has some reservations for the unrestricted freedom Reiss and Vermeer, and Holz-Mantari have given the translator to produce a target text of whatever form so long as it conforms to the scapos as directed by the client. To check this, she introduces the concept of loyalty, which she defines as the responsibility translators have towards their partners. Translators, in their role as mediators between two cultures, have a special responsibility with regard to their partners, i.e. the source text author, the client or commissioner of the translation, and the target text receivers, and towards themselves, precisely in those cases where there are differing views as to what a good translation is or should be. Nord 2006, 33. Nord thus contends that the scapos is not the only determining factor in translation, that loyalty is necessary. Loyalty commits the translator bilaterally to the source text and target text situations, not to falsify the source text author's intentions, Nord 2005:32, and fulfilling the expectations of the target audience or explaining in a footnote or preface how they arrived at a particular meaning. Loyalty is different from fidelity or equivalence in that the latter refer to the linguistic or stylistic similarity between the source and the target texts, regardless of the communicative intentions involved, while the former refers to an interpersonal relationship between the translator and their partners. 2001, 185. Christiane Nord also elaborates on the possible range of functions a target text may have, different from that or those of the source text. She first distinguishes between documentary translation and instrumental translation. Documentary translation is such that aims at producing in the target language a kind of document of certain aspects of a communicative interaction in which a source culture sender communicates with a source culture audience via the source text under source culture conditions. 1997, 138. Instrumental translation, on the other hand, aims at producing in the target language an instrument for a new communicative interaction between the source culture sender and the target culture audience. A documentary translation usually results in a target text with a metatextual function or secondary level function according to House, 1977. An instrumental translation may have the same range of functions as the source text, whereby it is said to be equifunctional, but if there are differences in the functions of both texts, the case is said to be heterofunctional. Nord also talks about homologous translation, also called creative transposition, BaseNet 2002, 24, where the target text represent the same degree of originality as the original in relation to the respective culture-specific corpora of texts. One other seminal input of Nord's into functionalism is her call for an elaborate analysis of the source text before translation proper. Unlike Vermeer and Holzman-Tari, who almost make the source text so invisible, Nord rather gives some attention to it, since it is the provider of the offer of information that forms the basis for the offer of information formulated in the target text. She argues that the pre-translation analysis of the source text helps in deciding on whether the translation project is feasible in the first place, which source text units are relevant to a functional translation, and which strategy will best produce a target text that meets the requirements of the brief. Nord 1997, 62. Nord goes further to identify and categorize the kind of problems a translator might encounter: pragmatic, convention-related, interlingual and text-specific, and also steps to follow in the translational process. Schiefner, 2001, has done a critical review of Nord's postulations, and indeed other functionalist approaches, and their applicability in practical translation. Controversies surrounding functionalist approaches to translation. Expectedly, functionalist approaches have received a lot of criticism, especially from scholars of the linguistic-based approaches, one of which is the definition of translation. Critics of Scappo's theory argue that not all target texts based on a source text can be called translations, that Scappo's theory makes no distinction between a real translation and adaptation, or what Kohler, 1995, calls non-translation. They argue that the supposed dethronement of the source text and focus on the target text, Newmark 1991, Schriett-Muller 1994, subverts the intrinsic meaning of the translation. PYM, 1997, argues in this light and supports Kohler, 1995, in upholding equivalence and calling on functionalists to distinguish between translation and non-translation. However, functionalists view translation from a broader perspective, as any translational action where a source text is transferred into a target culture and language. Nord 1997, 141. They see the linguistic-based definition as being restrictive and in need of expansion. Linked to this is the supposed dethronement of the source text and emphasis on the scappos as the determining factor of how the translation is done. It is then argued that functionalism gives translators the freedom to produce any kind of target text and call it a translation. PYM, 1991, for instance, accuses functionalists of producing mercenary experts able to fight under the flag of any purpose, able to pay them. 1991, 2. Nord responds to this by introducing the concept of loyalty, which restricts the liberty of the translator, as they are now expected to be loyal to the source text author as well as other partners in the translational process. She also insists on an elaborate source text analysis before translation for a better understanding of both the source text and source culture, which will then engender some high-level coherence between the source text and the target text. One other controversy surrounding functionalism is the myriad of terminologies introduced and used differently, especially those by Holzman-Tari. Indeed, many of these criticisms still go on to this day. However, despite the various controversies surrounding the development and thrust of functionalist approaches, their contributions to the study of translation are remarkable. Contributions of functionalist approaches to translation studies. One major contribution of this approach is that, according to Nord, 1997, 29, it addresses the eternal dilemmas of free vs faithful translations, dynamic vs formal equivalence, good interpreters vs slavish translators, and so on. Thus a translation may be free of faithful or anything between these two extremes depending on its scapos or the purpose for which it is needed. The translator no longer has to always go back to the source text to solve translational problems, rather they base their translation on the function of the text in the target culture. Functionalist approaches liberate translation from theories that impose linguistic rules upon every decision. PYM 2010, 56. They recognize that the translation process involves more than language is involved and requires the consideration of these extra-textual and extra-linguistic factors for its actualization. Thus they introduce the cultural dimension to translation studies and break the unnecessary recourse to the authority of the source text. While linguistics-based approaches may be said to be retrospective in that they look back at the source text as the model for the target text, functionalist approaches are seen as prospective in that they look forward to the function of the text in the target culture as the major determining factor for how the translation will be done. A retrospective translation operates a bottom-up process, works from source language elements and transfers the text sentence by sentence, or phrase by phrase. But a prospective translation operates a top-down process, starting on the pragmatic level by deciding on the intended function of the translation and asking for specific text typological conventions, and for addressees' background knowledge and their communicative needs. Yang 2009, 104. Functionalist approaches are flexible and general enough to account for a wide range of translational situations. Talking about the theory of Scapos theory, for example, Schiefner, 2001, 15, observes that his theory is presented as being sufficiently general to cover a multitude of individual cases, i.e. to be independent of individual languages, cultures, subject domains, text types and genres. Interestingly, the consideration of extra-textual factors in the translational process accentuates the multidisciplinary nature of translation studies. The introduction of text typology and considerations of genre conventions introduces elements of pragmatics, text linguistics and culture studies into the discourse. So also is the belief that a text does not have a stable intrinsic meaning, but that meaning is affected by the subjective translator as well as by the cultural, historical, ideological and historical circumstances surrounding the production of the text. Schiefner 2001, 12. Tied to the quality of flexibility mentioned above is functionalism's apparent accommodation of the shortcomings of some other translation theories. For example, Baker, 2007, criticizes the polysystem theory, even Zohar 1990, and Toes, 1995, theory of norms for encouraging analysts to focus on repeated, abstract, systematic behavior and privileging strong patterns of socialization into that behavior and for glossing over the numerous individual and group attempts at undermining dominant patterns and prevailing political and social dogma. Baker 2007, 152. She also expressed some dissatisfaction with Venuti's dichotomies of foreignizing and domesticating strategies. Venuti 1993, 1995. Also called minoritizing and majoritizing strategies, Venuti 1998, 4, inter alia, reducing the intricate means by which a translator negotiates his or her way around various aspects of a text into a more or less straightforward choice of foreignizing versus domesticating strategy, Baker 2007, 152. However, these criticisms have been adequately taken care of by functionalist approaches whose methodology would not be seen as being that straitjacketed, with no room for flexibility. By their very nature, functionalist approaches bridge the gap between mere theorizing and the practice of translation, as they suggest practical ways of going about translational problems. Before the advent of functionalist approaches, the translator is rarely noticed. Emphasis was on the source text and its supposed equivalent, the target text. No attention is paid to the identity or status of the translator in the translational process. On the one hand, the translator is seen as not being original, as merely performing a technical stunt, Honig 1985, 13. Of transferring an original author's ideas into a different language. On the other hand, the translator's identity is hidden when they produce texts that sound so fluent in the target culture as if they were. Applied Linguistics Group uploaded this video for BS English students. Dr. Khalid Malik, the founder, has a PhD in Applied Linguistics to Seoul. Having more than 25 research papers, he taught at many foreign universities and in a postdoctoral study program abroad. Join Applied Linguistics Group at youtube.com/@1966 Pakistani or use a QR code to join our Facebook group at https://www.facebook.com/groups/329136464149083.